Imagine a city built nearly 5,000 years ago in the river plains of what is now southern Pakistan, where every street runs in a straight line, where every house connects to a centralized sewage system, where the bricks used in construction are so uniform that a brick from the northern edge of the city is identical in dimension to a brick from the southern wall. Imagine a city where the main roads are 10 meters wide, where smaller lanes branch off at precise right angles, where covered drains run beneath every street and are fitted with removable stone panels so that maintenance workers can inspect them. Imagine a city with public bathing facilities, private wells in nearly every household, and a water management system so advanced that it would not be equaled anywhere on the planet for roughly 2,000 years. Now imagine that this city has no palace, no throne room, no monumental statue of a king, no military barracks, no triumphal arches, no depictions of warfare or conquest anywhere in its archaeological record. And then imagine that the people who built this city left behind a writing system that we cannot read, so that despite a century of excavation and study, we still do not know who governed them, what they believed, or what they called themselves. That city is Mohenjo-daro, and its urban planning remains one of the most extraordinary and most baffling achievements in the history of human civilization. We live in a world that takes urban planning for granted. We assume that cities have sewer systems, that streets follow some kind of grid, that buildings conform to codes and standards. But these things are not natural. They are not inevitable. They are the products of deliberate decisions made by people with the authority, the knowledge, and the resources to impose order on the chaos of human settlement. For most of human history, cities grew organically, streets following the paths of animals and pedestrians, buildings expanding without coordination, waste accumulating in open gutters or on the streets themselves. The idea that a city could be planned from the outset, that its streets could be laid out before the first building was erected, that its infrastructure could be designed as a unified system rather than cobbled together piecemeal over centuries. This idea is so recent in the history of most civilizations that we tend to think of it as a modern invention. But Mohenjo-daro had it nearly 5,000 years ago, and the city did it better than most modern cities do it today. This is not an exaggeration. This is not romantic nostalgia for the ancient past. The drainage system of Mohenjo-daro, laid out in approximately 2500 before the Common Era, was more comprehensive, more equitable, and more carefully maintained than the sanitation systems that served London, Paris, and New York well into the 19th century of our own era. In 1854, London was ravaged by a cholera epidemic that killed over 10,000 people. The cause was contaminated water, flowing through an open sewer system that mixed human waste with the city's drinking supply. Mohenjo-daro, built more than 4,000 years earlier, had already solved this problem. Its wastewater flowed through sealed covered drains beneath the streets, separated from fresh water sources, maintained by a system of inspection and cleaning that speaks to a level of civic organization that we can barely comprehend. How did they do it? Who designed it? What kind of society produces this level of urban sophistication without leaving behind a single readable document explaining how it was governed? These are the questions that have haunted archaeologists for more than a century, ever since the ruins of Mohenjo-daro were first systematically excavated in the 1920s. The answers, as we will see, are elusive, contradictory, and in some cases deeply unsettling, because the more closely we examine the urban planning of Mohenjo-daro, the more we realize that it does not fit any of the models we use to understand ancient civilization. It is an anomaly, a puzzle, a city that should not exist according to everything we think we know about how ancient societies organized themselves. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand what makes the urban planning of Mohenjo-daro so extraordinary. You are going to see how its streets, its drains, its buildings, and its public spaces reveal a vision of urban life that is radically different from anything produced by ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, or Rome. You are going to confront the unsettling possibility that the people of Mohenjo-daro achieved something that we have not yet fully achieved ourselves, a city designed not for the glory of rulers, but for the well-being of ordinary people. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. The ruins of Mohenjo-daro sit beneath the sun of Sindh province, crumbling slowly under the assault of salt, wind, and neglect. Every year, a little more of what remains is lost. The bricks that survived 4 millennia are now dissolving, their surfaces eaten away by salt crystallization drawn up from the water table. The drains that once carried wastewater beneath clean streets are collapsing. The walls that once enclosed a city of perhaps 40,000 people are returning to the dust from which they were made. Time is running out, not for the mystery will endure, but for the physical evidence that might one day help us solve it. The city that was the most carefully planned settlement of the ancient world is being destroyed by the most banal of forces: water, salt, and the slow indifference of time. Now, let's begin. To appreciate what makes Mohenjo-daro exceptional, we need to understand what cities looked like in the rest of the ancient world during the same era. We need a baseline. We need to see what was normal so that we can recognize just how abnormal Mohenjo-daro truly was. Around 2500 before the Common Era, the time when Mohenjo-daro was at its peak, several other major civilizations were flourishing across the ancient world. In Egypt, the Old Kingdom was in full bloom. The Great Pyramid of Giza had recently been completed, or was in the final stages of construction, under the reign of Pharaoh Khufu. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerian city-states of Ur, Uruk, and Lagash were thriving along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These were among the most advanced societies on Earth. They had writing systems. They had monumental architecture. They had complex systems of government, religion, and trade. And yet, in terms of urban planning and civic infrastructure, none of them came close to what was being built along the banks of the Indus River. Consider the city of Ur in Mesopotamia, one of the most well-documented urban centers of the ancient Near East. Ur was a great city, home to perhaps 65,000 people at its height. It had magnificent temples, including the famous ziggurat of Ur-Nammu, a massive stepped pyramid that still dominates the site today. It had a royal cemetery filled with gold, lapis lazuli, and the remains of servants who were sacrificed to accompany their rulers into the afterlife. Ur was wealthy, powerful, and culturally sophisticated, but its streets were narrow, winding, and unplanned. They followed no grid, they had no drainage system. Waste was dumped in courtyards or in the street. Houses were packed together haphazardly, sharing walls, blocking light, and creating a maze-like urban fabric that reflected centuries of uncoordinated growth. There was no overarching plan. The city had grown organically, each generation adding to the accumulated disorder of the one before. The same was true of almost every other city in the ancient world. The cities of ancient Egypt were focused around the pharaoh's palace and the great temples, the residential areas that housed the workers and craftspeople who built the monuments were functional but unplanned. Streets were irregular, sanitation was rudimentary. Even the planned workers' village at Deir el-Medina, which housed the artisans who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, was a modest affair, a small settlement of roughly 70 houses arranged in a loose grid, with no centralized drainage and no public water supply beyond a single well. Now place Mohenjo-daro next to these cities. The contrast is staggering. Mohenjo-daro, whose name in Sindhi means Mound of the Dead, is located in the Larkana district of Sindh province in present-day Pakistan, on the western bank of the Indus River. The site covers an area of roughly 250 hectares, though the full extent of the ancient city is difficult to determine because portions of it lie beneath the modern water table and cannot be excavated. The city was built on an artificial mound, raised above the surrounding floodplain to protect it from the seasonal flooding of the Indus. This alone represents a massive engineering undertaking. The platform on which the city rests is estimated to have required millions of mud bricks to construct, representing thousands of hours of organized labor directed toward a single civic purpose: protecting the community from flood. The city was divided into two main sections. On the western side, rising above the lower city on a separate, elevated platform roughly 12 meters high, stood what archaeologists call the citadel. This was not a military fortress in the conventional sense. It contained no defensive towers, no weapon stores, no barracks. Instead, it housed what appear to have been public buildings. The Great Bath, a large structure often called the granary, a pillared hall, and several other buildings whose functions remain debated. The citadel was surrounded by a massive mud brick wall, but whether this wall served a defensive, ceremonial, or purely functional purpose, perhaps as a retaining wall for the raised platform, is unknown. On the eastern side lay the lower city, the residential and commercial heart of Mohenjo-daro. It is here that the urban planning is most striking. The lower city was laid out on a grid pattern, with major streets running north to south and east to west, intersecting at right angles. The main streets were approximately 10 meters wide, broad enough for 2 ox carts to pass each other comfortably. These were not ceremonial boulevards, designed to impress visitors with the grandeur of a king. They were functional thoroughfares, designed for the efficient movement of people, goods, and waste. Branching off the main streets were narrower lanes, typically between 1.5 and 3 meters wide, which provided access to individual houses and workshops. The grid pattern of Mohenjo-daro is so precise that it has been compared to the grid plans of modern American cities. But there is a crucial difference. Modern grid cities, like New York or Chicago, were planned on paper before construction began, using surveying instruments, mathematical calculations, and centralized planning authorities backed by state power. Mohenjo-daro was built approximately 4,500 years ago, without metal surveying instruments, without paper, and, as far as we can determine, without any of the bureaucratic apparatus that modern urban planning requires. How was this level of precision achieved? We do not know. The city's planners left behind no blueprints, no surveyor's marks, no written planning documents. They left only the city itself, a physical record of decisions that we can observe but cannot explain. The precision extends far beyond the street layout. The bricks used in Mohenjo-daro's construction are of a standardized size, maintaining a consistent ratio of 4:2:1 in length, width, and height. The most common brick size was approximately 28 centimeters long, 14 centimeters wide, and 7 centimeters tall. This exact ratio and approximate size was maintained not only throughout Mohenjo-daro, but across the entire Indus Valley civilization, from Harappa in the Punjab, roughly 600 kilometers to the north, to Lothal on the coast of Gujarat, more than 700 kilometers to the southeast. This uniformity is without parallel in the ancient world. Egyptian builders used blocks of whatever size and shape were convenient. Mesopotamian brick sizes varied from city to city, and even from building to building within the same city. Only the Indus Valley civilization maintained this extraordinary consistency. The implications of standardized bricks are profound and far-reaching. Standardization implies measurement. It implies that there was a shared system of units, understood and applied by brick makers across the entire civilization. It implies quality control. Someone, some authority, was checking that the bricks met the standard. It implies a supply chain. Bricks had to be produced in quantities sufficient to build an entire city, and they had to be produced to specification. It implies training. Brick makers had to be taught the correct proportions and held to them. And it implies coordination on a scale that is difficult to fathom for a society operating without wheeled vehicles in most regions, without money in the modern sense, and without any form of written record that we can read. The weight system of the Indus Valley civilization provides additional evidence of this extraordinary standardization. Archaeologists have recovered hundreds of small, precisely cut and polished stone cubes from Harappan sites. These weights follow a binary decimal progression. In the lower ranges, each weight doubles the one before it, proceeding from 1 unit to 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and 64. In the higher ranges, the progression shifts to a decimal pattern. The base unit is approximately 0.87 grams. The weights are accurate to a degree that speaks to meticulous craftsmanship and rigorous quality standards. A weight from Mohenjo-daro matches a weight from Harappa 600 kilometers away, with a precision that modern scientists find impressive. These weights were not decorative objects. They were tools of commerce and governance. Their uniformity across the entire civilization implies a shared commitment to honest measurement, a commitment enforced by some form of authority across an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. The weights tell us that the people of Mohenjo-daro lived within a system of rules, standards, and expectations that governed the production of goods, the conduct of trade, and the construction of the built environment. They tell us that this system was maintained consistently over centuries and across vast distances. But they do not tell us who designed the system, who enforced it, or how. Now let us look at the drainage system, because it is here that the urban planning of Mohenjo-daro reaches its most astonishing level of sophistication. Nearly every house in Mohenjo-daro had a bathing platform, a room with a carefully paved, slightly sloped floor designed to channel water toward a drain. Many houses also had what archaeologists interpret as toilets, consisting of a seat set above a vertical drain shaft connected to the street drainage system. Wastewater from these domestic facilities flowed through clay pipes set into the walls of the houses and out into covered drains that ran beneath the streets. The street drains were constructed of carefully fitted bricks, lined with smooth mortar, and covered with removable stone or brick slabs. At regular intervals, the drains were fitted with sump pits, small chambers that collected sediment and prevented the main drainage channels from becoming blocked. The covers could be lifted for inspection and cleaning, suggesting that there was an organized system of maintenance, a workforce, perhaps a municipal authority, responsible for keeping the drains in working order. The drainage system was not an afterthought. It was not added to the city after construction. It was integrated into the city's design from the beginning. The streets were built with the drains already in place beneath them. The houses were designed with their bathing platforms and waste pipes already connected to the street drains. The entire system was conceived and executed as a unified whole. This is a level of infrastructure planning that would not be seen again in the region, or arguably anywhere in the world, for millennia. Consider what this means in practical terms. A city of perhaps 30 to 40,000 people, living in a hot, semi-arid climate, with no modern pumping technology, no electric motors, no chemical disinfectants, managed to create a sanitation system that kept wastewater separate from living spaces, channeled it through sealed conduits away from the residential areas, and maintained this system through regular inspection and cleaning. The health benefits would have been enormous. In a world where waterborne diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery were major killers, a functioning sewage system was not a luxury, it was a lifesaver. The people of Mohenjo-daro may not have understood germ theory, but they understood that separating waste from living space was essential to health, and they built their entire city around that understanding. The Great Bath, located on the Citadel Mound, is perhaps the most iconic structure at Mohenjo-daro and one of the most discussed buildings in all of ancient archaeology. It is a large rectangular pool measuring approximately 12 meters long, 7 meters wide, and 2.4 meters deep. The pool is built of finely fitted bricks sealed with a thick layer of natural bitumen, a tar-like substance that made the structure completely waterproof. The floor of the pool slopes slightly toward one corner, where a drain allows the pool to be emptied for cleaning. Steps at the northern and southern ends provide access into the water. Surrounding the pool on all sides are a series of small rooms, possibly changing rooms, private bathing chambers, or rooms for ritual preparation. A large well located nearby provided fresh water to fill the pool, and a sophisticated overflow and drainage system prevented flooding. The engineering of the Great Bath is remarkable. The waterproofing alone represents a significant technological achievement. The bitumen lining was applied between two layers of brick, creating a sandwich construction that prevented leakage even under the considerable hydrostatic pressure of a pool 2.4 meters deep. The drainage system allowed the pool to be emptied, cleaned, and refilled, a process that suggests regular maintenance and a concern for hygiene that goes beyond what most ancient cultures demonstrated. But the Great Bath's significance extends beyond engineering. Its prominence, located on the highest point of the city, in the civic and ceremonial heart of Mohenjo-daro, suggests that bathing had a special significance in Harappan culture that went beyond mere physical cleanliness. Many scholars have drawn parallels to the ritual bathing practices that remain central to religious life in South Asia today. The Ghats of Varanasi, where millions of Hindu pilgrims bathe in the Ganges River each year, may represent a distant echo of a tradition that began in the cities of the Indus Valley thousands of years before the Common Era. If the Great Bath served a ritual function, then it represents the intersection of engineering, civic planning, and spiritual life, a place where the technical mastery of the Harappan builders served not only physical needs, but also the deeper needs of the human spirit. The scale of Mohenjo-daro's infrastructure can be measured in numbers that, even today, inspire a quiet awe. Archaeologists have estimated that the city contained approximately 700 wells within its excavated area alone. Given that only about 1/3 of the city has been excavated, the total number of wells in the original city may have been over 2,000. Each well was constructed of specially shaped wedge-like bricks, designed to form a perfect cylinder without mortar. The wells were deep, some extending more than 15 meters below the surface, and they were built to last. Many of Mohenjo-daro's wells have survived intact for nearly 5,000 years, their cylindrical shafts still standing, their brickwork still sound. The density of wells in Mohenjo-daro is extraordinary. It suggests that fresh water was available to virtually every household, or at least to every neighborhood. In most ancient cities, water supply was a major source of inequality. The wealthy had private wells or access to aqueducts. The poor carried water from public fountains or rivers, often walking considerable distances. In Mohenjo-daro, the abundance of wells suggests a more equitable distribution of this essential resource. Water, the most fundamental necessity of urban life, appears to have been available to all. This was not a city where the wealthy bathed while the poor went thirsty. This was a city where the infrastructure of daily life was designed for the benefit of the entire population. The excavation history of Mohenjo-daro is itself a story worth telling, because it reveals how profoundly the city challenged the expectations of those who first uncovered it. The site was first noted by R.D. Banerjee of the Archaeological Survey of India in 1919, when he visited the mound looking for what he believed was a Buddhist stupa, a dome-shaped religious monument dating to the early centuries of the Common Era. Banerjee conducted preliminary excavations and found artifacts that were clearly much older than any Buddhist period remains. In 1922, he reported his findings to Sir John Marshall, the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India. Marshall, who was simultaneously learning of similar finds at Harappa in the Punjab, recognized the significance of the discoveries and authorized large-scale excavations. The work that followed, led by Marshall, Ernest Mackay, and later by Mortimer Wheeler and others, gradually revealed the outlines of a city that defied every expectation. Archaeologists trained in the traditions of Egyptian and Mesopotamian studies expected to find palaces, temples, royal statuary, and the material evidence of kingship. Instead, they found drains. They found bricks. They found wells. They found bathing platforms. They found a great bath that was magnificent in its engineering, but modest in its decoration. They found a city that seemed to have poured its collective genius, not into the glorification of power, but into the infrastructure of everyday life. Marshall himself struggled to describe what he had found. In his published reports, he expressed bewilderment at the absence of monumental religious architecture and the apparent lack of a ruling elite. The city did not fit the categories that archaeology had developed to understand ancient urbanism. The residential architecture of Mohenjo-daro reinforces this impression of civic equality. Houses in the lower city were built of fired brick, which was itself a mark of quality. In many ancient cities, fired brick was reserved for public buildings, while ordinary homes were built of mud brick, which was cheaper but less durable. In Mohenjo-daro, even modest homes were constructed of fired brick. The houses varied in size from single-room dwellings to large courtyard. Houses with dozens of rooms arranged around a central open space. The larger houses had multiple stories, with staircases providing access to upper floors. Windows were small and set high in the walls, a design that provided ventilation while maintaining privacy and keeping out the worst of the heat. One architectural feature found throughout the city is particularly revealing. The houses of Mohenjo-daro present blank walls to the street. Their entrances are set on side lanes, not on the main thoroughfares. This design choice, consistently maintained across the entire city, suggests a concern for privacy and security that was deeply embedded in Harappan culture. It also suggests planning. Someone decided that houses should face away from the main streets. Someone established this as a standard that was followed by every builder in the city. The uniformity of the convention implies that it was not a matter of individual preference, but of shared rule or custom. Inside the houses, the layouts follow certain consistent patterns. Most houses had a central courtyard that served as the main living space, providing light and air to the rooms that surrounded it. Cooking areas were typically located in a specific part of the house, away from the main living areas. Bathing platforms were positioned near exterior walls, where the waste pipes could connect most easily to the street drains outside. Staircases were built against exterior walls. These patterns are so consistent across the city that they suggest not merely shared custom but deliberate planning, as if there were standards for residential construction that every builder was expected to follow. The numbers are striking when we compare Mohenjo-daro's infrastructure to that of its contemporaries. Consider ancient Rome, often celebrated as the pinnacle of classical urban engineering. Rome's famous Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer that drained the Forum, was built in approximately 600 before the Common Era, roughly 2,000 years after Mohenjo-daro's drainage system, and the Cloaca Maxima was an open channel for most of its history. It was not sealed and covered in the way that Mohenjo-daro's drains were from the beginning. Rome's aqueducts, those magnificent feats of engineering that brought fresh water to the city from distant mountains, were built over a period of 500 years, from 312 before the Common Era onward. Mohenjo-daro achieved comparable water supply on a proportional scale more than 2,000 years earlier. Or consider London. In the early 19th century, London was the largest city in the world, the capital of the most powerful empire on earth, and yet its sanitation system was a horror. Human waste flowed into the River Thames, which also served as the city's primary source of drinking water. The Great Stink of 1858, when the smell of untreated sewage in the Thames became so overwhelming that Parliament was forced to adjourn, finally prompted the construction of a modern sewer system under the direction of the engineer Joseph Bazalgette. That system, completed in the 1860s, achieved roughly the same thing that Mohenjo-daro had achieved more than 4,000 years earlier: the separation of wastewater from living space through a system of covered underground drains. The comparison is humbling. It does not flatter the modern world. There is another comparison that illuminates the scale of Mohenjo-daro's achievement. The Minoan civilization of Crete, which flourished between approximately 2700 and 1450 before the Common Era, is often cited as the earliest example of advanced plumbing in the Western world. The Palace of Knossos had a drainage system, and some Minoan homes had flush toilets and bathing facilities. These are genuinely impressive achievements, and the Minoans deserve credit for them. But Knossos was a palace. Its plumbing served a royal household. The broader population of Minoan Crete did not have comparable access to sanitation infrastructure. In Mohenjo-daro, the drainage system served the entire city. Every neighborhood, every block, every household that has been excavated shows connections to the centralized drainage network. The democratic character of Mohenjo-daro's infrastructure is what makes it exceptional. It is not that they had drains. Other civilizations had drains. It is that everyone had drains. Consider what it takes to build a city-wide drainage system from scratch without modern technology. You need to survey the entire site and determine the natural slope of the terrain, because a gravity-fed drainage system only works if the drains are graded correctly, descending from higher elevations to lower. You need to calculate the volume of wastewater that will be generated by the population and size the drains accordingly. You need to plan the layout of every street and every building so that the domestic waste pipes connect seamlessly to the street drains. You need to locate the sump pits at intervals that will prevent blockage. You need to decide where the wastewater will ultimately be discharged. You need to do all of this before the first foundation stone is laid, because the drains run beneath the streets and must be in place before the streets are paved and the houses built on top of them. This is not the work of individual households improvising solutions to their own waste problems. This is centralized planning of the highest order. All of this raises a question that has nagged at archaeologists since the first excavations in the 1920s. How was this level of urban planning achieved? What kind of authority, what kind of social organization, what kind of governance could produce a city of this sophistication in the Bronze Age? The question is not merely academic. It goes to the heart of how we understand the relationship between power, planning, and the public good. In every other ancient civilization we know of, monumental public works required monumental authority. The pyramids of Egypt were built by a god king who commanded the labor of tens of thousands. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia were commissioned by kings and maintained by powerful priesthoods. The roads and aqueducts of Rome were built by a state with the military power to conscript labor and the administrative apparatus to manage vast projects. In each case, centralized hierarchical authority was the engine that drove large-scale construction. Power flowed downward from a single ruler or a small ruling elite, and the built environment reflected that concentration of power. Palaces were grand, temples were magnificent, the homes of the poor were cramped and neglected. Public infrastructure, when it existed, served the interests of the powerful first, and the common people only incidentally. Mohenjo-daro does not fit this pattern. There is no palace, there is no royal tomb filled with treasure, there is no monumental statue of a ruler. There are no inscriptions celebrating military victories. The largest and most impressive structures in the city, the Great Bath, the Granary, the Assembly Hall, are all public buildings designed to serve the community as a whole. The residential architecture shows a remarkable degree of uniformity. There are larger houses and smaller houses, suggesting some degree of economic inequality, but the differences are modest compared to what we see in contemporary Egypt or Mesopotamia. Even the smallest houses in Mohenjo-daro had access to the drainage system. Even the most modest dwellings had bathing platforms and connections to the city's waste management infrastructure. Something is wrong with our assumptions about ancient governance. If large-scale urban planning requires centralized, hierarchical authority, then Mohenjo-daro should have a palace. It should have a king's tomb. It should have the trappings of concentrated power that we find in every other ancient city that achieved incomparable feats of engineering. But it does not. Either our assumption is wrong, and large-scale planning can be achieved without centralized authority, or the authority existed but expressed itself in a form so different from anything we are accustomed to that we cannot recognize it in the archaeological record. This is the central mystery of Mohenjo-daro's urban planning. Not how the drains were built, not how the bricks were standardized, but who decided that they should be, who conceived the plan, who enforced the standards, and why they chose to build a city that served its people rather than glorifying its rulers. And this is where the answer becomes deeply unsettling, because after a century of excavation and study, we still do not know. The core problem of Mohenjo-daro is not an engineering problem. The drains work, the grid makes sense, the bricks fit. The core problem is a political one. Who was in charge? Every aspect of the city's design implies central planning, coordinated authority, enforced standards. And yet the archaeological record contains no evidence of the kind of centralized hierarchical power that we associate with large-scale urban planning in every other ancient civilization. This contradiction sits at the heart of a century of scholarly debate, and it remains unresolved. It is the puzzle that draws archaeologists back to Mohenjo-daro generation after generation, the riddle that makes the city more than just an interesting ruin. It makes it a test case for our most basic assumptions about power, society, and the human capacity for collective achievement. Let us be precise about what the evidence shows and what it does not show. The evidence shows a city built according to a unified plan, with standardized building materials, consistent architectural conventions, and integrated infrastructure. The evidence shows a weight system maintained to extraordinary precision across the entire civilization. The evidence shows a system of inscribed seals, probably used for authenticating goods or documents, that is found throughout the Indus Valley, suggesting some form of administrative apparatus. The evidence shows public buildings, the Great Bath, the granary, the assembly hall, that were clearly designed for communal use. The evidence shows a city that functioned smoothly, that was maintained and repaired over centuries, that sustained a large population in reasonable comfort and apparent health. What the evidence does not show is equally important. There are no palaces, no grand tombs filled with royal regalia, no monumental sculptures of rulers, no carved reliefs depicting military conquests or divine kingship, no hordes of weapons suggesting a military elite, no depictions of violence of any kind. The Indus Valley civilization, across its entire geographical extent and its entire 700-year history, has produced almost no imagery of warfare, kingship, or individual authority. This absence is so striking, so consistent, and so unlike anything found in contemporary Egypt or Mesopotamia that it has become one of the defining features of the civilization and one of its deepest mysteries. The archaeologist Gregory Possehl, one of the most influential scholars of the Indus Valley civilization, before his death in 2011, proposed a concept he called the faceless civilization. Possehl argued that the Indus Valley was unique among early complex societies in its apparent lack of a visible ruling class. In Egypt, the face of the pharaoh was everywhere, on statues, on temple walls, on coins, on seals. In Mesopotamia, kings erected monuments to themselves and recorded their victories in stone. But in the Indus Valley, there are no faces. The few figurines that might represent individuals are small, schematic, and show no signs of representing authority. The famous bronze statuette, known as the Dancing Girl of Mohenjo-daro, depicts a young woman standing in a casual, confident pose, wearing bangles on one arm and nothing else. She is beautiful. She is memorable, but she is not a queen. She carries no scepter, wears no crown, sits on no throne. She is simply a person, depicted as a person, with none of the markers of political or religious authority that dominate the art of every other ancient civilization. The priest-king figurine, another famous artifact from Mohenjo-daro, is sometimes cited as evidence of a ruling class. It is a small stone bust, only about 17.5 centimeters tall, depicting a bearded man with half-closed eyes, wearing a headband with a circular ornament and a cloak decorated with trefoil, or three-lobed patterns. Marshall, who first described the figurine, called it the priest-king, by analogy with Mesopotamian rulers, who combined religious and political authority. But the name is a projection, not a deduction. There is nothing about the figurine that conclusively identifies it as a ruler. It could be a priest, it could be a merchant, it could be a deity, it could be someone we have no category for. The name priest-king tells us more about the expectations of early 20th century archaeologists than it does about the person depicted. Only a single such figurine has been found. In Egypt, images of the pharaoh number in the thousands. In Mesopotamia, royal statuary fills entire museum galleries. One ambiguous bust from Mohenjo-daro is hardly evidence of a royal tradition. The seals of the Indus Valley civilization offer another tantalizing but ultimately frustrating window into the question of governance. Over 3,500 seals have been recovered from Harappan sites, the majority of them square or rectangular, carved from steatite, a soft stone that could be fired to a harder finish. Each seal bears an image, most commonly a single animal, the most frequent being a one-horned creature that scholars call the unicorn, though it may represent a bull in profile. Other animals depicted include the Indian humped bull, the elephant, the rhinoceros, the water buffalo, and the tiger. Above or around the animal image is a short inscription in the Indus script, typically between 3 and 7 symbols long. The seals were clearly functional objects. They were used to stamp impressions in wet clay, probably to seal packages of trade goods, to authenticate documents, or to mark property. The diversity of seal designs suggests that individual seals were associated with specific persons, families, or institutions. If each seal represented a different trader, merchant house, or administrative unit, then the variety of seals is evidence of a distributed commercial system rather than a centralized bureaucracy. The seals do not bear royal cartouches or imperial emblems. They bear the marks of individual participants in a commercial network, participants who needed to authenticate their goods and their agreements, but who did not, as far as we can tell, answer to a single supreme authority. The craft workshops of Mohenjo-daro provide additional evidence for the city's social structure. Excavations have revealed specialized workshops for bead making, shell working, pottery production, and metalworking. These workshops were distributed throughout the lower city, integrated into residential neighborhoods, rather than concentrated in a single industrial district. This distribution pattern suggests that craft production was organized at the household or neighborhood level rather than by a centralized administration. In Mesopotamia, by contrast, craft workshops were often attached to temples or palaces, producing goods under the direct supervision and for the direct benefit of the ruling elite. In Mohenjo-daro, the workshops appear to have been independent enterprises, producing goods for local use and for trade. The bead-making workshops are particularly revealing. The production of long barrel-shaped carnelian beads, one of the most distinctive and valuable products of the Indus Valley civilization, was an extraordinarily skilled and labor-intensive process. A single bead could take days to produce, involving careful selection of raw material, heating to enhance color, shaping by grinding, and drilling with a slender copper or bronze drill. The finished beads were objects of great beauty and were traded across the ancient Near East. They have been found in Mesopotamian royal tombs, where they were prized as luxury goods. The fact that such sophisticated craft production took place in distributed workshops throughout the city, rather than in a single state-controlled facility, suggests an economic system in which skilled artisans retained a significant degree of independence and probably benefited directly from the sale of their products. But here is the problem. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The fact that we have not found a palace at Mohenjo-daro does not mean one never existed. Only about 1/3 of the city has been excavated. Significant portions of the site lie beneath the modern water table and cannot be reached with current archaeological techniques. It is entirely possible that a palace, a royal cemetery, or a monumental temple lies buried in the unexcavated portions of the city, waiting to overturn everything we think we know about Harappan governance. Archaeologists must work with the evidence they have, but they must also remain humble about the limitations of that evidence. There is also the possibility that the governing elite of Mohenjo-daro expressed its authority in materials that have not survived. If the rulers of the Indus Valley wore robes of fine cotton rather than crowns of gold, their regalia would have rotted away within years of being discarded. If they lived in buildings of wood rather than stone, those buildings would have left little trace in the archaeological record. If they were commemorated in oral traditions rather than carved inscriptions, those traditions would have been lost when the civilization dispersed. If their authority was expressed through perishable documents, written on palm leaves or bark cloth, those documents would have disintegrated within decades. The apparent absence of a ruling elite might be an artifact of preservation rather than a reflection of social reality. Furthermore, the nature of the Indus River floodplain complicates excavation. The water table at Mohenjo-daro has risen significantly over the millennia since the city was inhabited. The lowest and oldest levels of the site are permanently waterlogged and cannot be excavated using conventional archaeological techniques. These inaccessible levels may contain the most important evidence about the city's founding, its earliest governance structures, and the decisions that shaped its urban plan. The city we see today is largely the city of the Middle and Late periods, rebuilt after multiple floods. The original city, the one that first established the grid and the drains and the standards, lies beneath water, beyond our reach. These caveats are important, but they do not eliminate the puzzle. Even accounting for incomplete excavation and differential preservation, the contrast between Mohenjo-daro and its contemporaries is profound. In every other early civilization we know of, evidence of rulership is abundant, conspicuous and impossible to miss, even in partially excavated sites. A few trenches at any Egyptian site of the Old Kingdom will turn up evidence of pharaonic authority. A few seasons of excavation at any Mesopotamian city will reveal temples, royal inscriptions, and the administrative records of powerful rulers. The Indus Valley has been excavated for over 100 years at dozens of sites across a subcontinental area, and the evidence for hierarchical rulership remains vanishingly thin. At some point, the absence of evidence becomes evidence in its own right. Not proof, but evidence. And it gets stranger, because the more we look at Mohenjo-daro, the more the evidence seems to point not toward hidden kings, but towards something genuinely different, a form of social organization that does not fit comfortably into any of our existing categories. Consider the residential architecture again. As noted earlier, the houses of Mohenjo-daro vary in size but not dramatically. There are large courtyard houses with many rooms, and there are smaller houses with fewer rooms. But the largest houses in Mohenjo-daro are modest compared to the palatial residences found in contemporary Egypt or Mesopotamia. More importantly, even the smallest houses have access to the same infrastructure as the largest. The same drains, the same wells, the same bathing facilities. The gap between the richest and poorest homes in Mohenjo-daro is far narrower than in any other ancient city of comparable size. This relative equality is reflected in the burial practices as well. The graves found at Harappa, the other major Harappan city where significant burial evidence has been recovered, are simple. Bodies were typically placed in rectangular pits, lying on their backs with heads pointing to the north. Grave goods were modest, a few ceramic vessels, some personal ornaments, occasionally a copper mirror or a shell bangle. There are no royal tombs. There are no graves filled with gold, lapis lazuli, and sacrifice servants, as we find at Ur in Mesopotamia. There are no pyramids or mastabas, as we find in Egypt. The dead of the Indus Valley were buried simply, without the extravagant display of wealth and status that characterizes elite burials in every other ancient civilization. Some scholars have interpreted this evidence as suggesting that the Indus Valley civilization was genuinely more egalitarian than its contemporaries. Not perfectly equal, certainly. The variation in house sizes confirms that some people had more wealth than others, but the difference was one of degree, not of kind. There was no vast chasm between a god-king living in a palace and peasants labouring in mud huts. There was, instead, a more graduated spectrum of wealth and status, compressed into a narrower range than anything found elsewhere in the ancient world. If the Indus Valley was indeed more egalitarian, this raises a profound question about the relationship between equality and urban planning. We tend to assume that centralized planning requires centralized power, that the only way to build a city as sophisticated as Mohenjo-daro is to concentrate authority in the hands of a single ruler or a small ruling class. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if there are other ways to achieve large-scale coordination? What if a society of roughly equal citizens, bound together by shared norms and mutual agreement rather than by the power of a king, can produce urban infrastructure that rivals or surpasses anything produced by the most powerful monarchies? This is a radical idea. It challenges some of the most deeply held assumptions of political theory and urban studies. The conventional wisdom holds that complex societies require hierarchical governance, that large-scale projects require coercive authority, that the state, with its monopoly on violence and its power to command labor and resources, is the essential engine of civilizational achievement. Mohenjo-daro challenges this wisdom. It suggests that there may be alternative paths to urban sophistication, paths that do not require a king, paths that are based on cooperation and shared norms rather than on command and obedience. Not all scholars accept this interpretation. Some argue that the evidence for egalitarianism has been overstated, that the Indus Valley had a ruling elite whose material expressions of power simply differed from those of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Perhaps the rulers of the Indus Valley expressed their authority through the control of trade rather than through monumental architecture. Perhaps they were merchant princes whose power was economic rather than military. Perhaps they were priestly figures whose authority was spiritual rather than political. Any of these possibilities could explain the absence of palaces and royal tombs, while still preserving the assumption that hierarchical governance was necessary for the kind of urban planning we see at Mohenjo-daro. The debate continues. It has continued for 100 years. It will likely continue for 100 more, unless some revolutionary discovery, a bilingual inscription, a royal archive, a palace buried beneath the water table, provides the evidence needed to resolve it. For now, Mohenjo-daro stands as a challenge to our understanding of how complex societies work. It is a city that should not exist, according to conventional political theory. And yet it does exist. Its drains are real, its bricks are real, its grid is real. The city was built. The city functioned. The city sustained tens of thousands of people for centuries. The only question is how. There is one more piece of evidence that deepens the mystery. The Indus script, found on thousands of seals and other artifacts from Mohenjo-daro and other Harappan sites, remains undeciphered. It consists of between 400 and 600 distinct symbols. The inscriptions are typically very short, averaging fewer than 5 symbols. The longest known inscription contains only 26 symbols. Dozens of attempts at decipherment have been made over the past century. None has been accepted by the broader scholarly community. Every few years, a new claim of decipherment is announced, generates excitement, and then is rejected by specialists who find the methodology unconvincing or the results unreplicable. The script remains locked. The challenge is partly one of quantity. The total corpus of Indus inscriptions is large, with over 4,000 inscribed objects recovered, but the individual inscriptions are very short. Most consist of fewer than 5 symbols. The longest known inscription, found on a broken surface, contains only 26 symbols. Compare this to the Rosetta Stone, which provided Jean-François Champollion with the key to Egyptian hieroglyphics in 1822. The Rosetta Stone contains the same text in 3 scripts, including Greek, which was already understood. It contains hundreds of words and multiple repetitions of key phrases. Linear B, the script of Mycenaean Greece, was deciphered by Michael Ventris in 1952 using long administrative lists that contained repeated words in predictable patterns. The Indus script has no Rosetta Stone, it has no long texts, it has no bilingual inscriptions. The brevity of the inscriptions means there are simply too few symbols to identify the patterns of repetition and variation that decipherment requires. There is one tantalizing exception that hints at the possibility of longer inscriptions now lost. At the site of Dholavira in Gujarat, archaeologists discovered what appears to be a large signboard. It consists of a series of 10 large Indus symbols, each approximately 37 centimeters tall, carved from white stone, and originally set into a wooden board above one of the city's gateways. This is the largest known Indus inscription, and the only one that was clearly meant for public display. Its placement above a city gate suggests that it served a function analogous to a modern civic sign, perhaps identifying the city, the governing authority, or the institution housed within. If we could read those 10 symbols, we might learn more about Harappan governance than a century of excavation has told us, but we cannot read them. The 10 symbols stare out across the ruins of Dholavira in permanent silence, a message addressed to the world that the world cannot understand. The implications of this linguistic silence are profound. We cannot read the administrative records of Mohenjo-daro, if such records existed. We cannot read the labels on the seals, which might have identified individuals, institutions, or trade goods. We cannot read any laws, any decrees, any regulations that might have governed the city's planning and construction standards. We are trying to understand the governance of a city whose governors are invisible and whose documents are unreadable. We are trying to solve a political puzzle without access to the political language of the people who created it. Some scholars have even questioned whether the Indus script is a true writing system at all. Steve Farmer, Richard Sproat, and Michael Witzel published a controversial paper in 2004 arguing that the Indus symbols are not linguistic writing, but rather a collection of non-linguistic signs comparable to modern heraldic emblems or religious symbols. If they are correct, then the Indus Valley civilization was the only major ancient civilization to develop urban planning, long-distance trade, and standardized systems of measurement without true literacy. This would make the achievement of Mohenjo-daro even more extraordinary, because it would mean that the city was planned and governed without the aid of written records, plans, or administrative documents. Every standard, every convention, every rule would have to have been transmitted orally, memorized, and enforced through social norms rather than through written law. Other scholars strongly disagree with the Farmer-Sproat-Witzel hypothesis. Asko Parpola of the University of Helsinki, who has spent decades studying the Indus script, argues that the symbols show clear evidence of linguistic structure, including the kind of positional variation and combinatorial patterns that are characteristic of true writing systems. Iravatham Mahadevan, an Indian scholar who created the first comprehensive concordance of Indus inscriptions, also argued for a linguistic interpretation. The debate is fierce, technical, and unresolved. Whatever the Indus symbols represent, their brevity is itself significant for understanding Mohenjo-daro's urban planning. If the longest inscription contains only 26 symbols, then the Indus people were not producing the kind of lengthy administrative texts that we find in Mesopotamia. Tax records, census lists, building plans, legal codes, royal decrees. If such records existed, they were written on materials that have not survived, perhaps palm leaves, cloth, or wooden boards, or they did not exist at all, and the entire apparatus of urban planning was maintained through oral tradition, social custom, and the accumulated practice of generations of builders who learnt their craft not from books, but from their elders. This last possibility is the most radical and the most difficult for modern minds to accept. We live in a world of blueprints, building codes, zoning regulations, and environmental impact statements. We cannot imagine building a city without written plans. But the people of Mohenjo-daro may have done exactly that. They may have built one of the most carefully planned cities in the history of the world, without writing a single plan down. They may have carried the entire design in their collective memory, transmitted from master builder to apprentice, from generation to generation, maintained not by bureaucratic enforcement, but by shared understanding and shared commitment to a common standard. If this is true, then the urban planning of Mohenjo-daro represents an achievement not just of engineering but of social cohesion. A community that can build a city from shared memory and shared norms, without written rules and without coercive enforcement, is a community bound together by something stronger than law. It is a community bound by trust, and trust, unlike stone or brick, leaves no trace in the archaeological record. It cannot be excavated, it cannot be carbon dated. It can only be inferred from its effects, and its effects at Mohenjo-daro are visible in every street, every drain, every precisely standardized brick. Consider the maintenance of the drainage system over time. A drainage system does not maintain itself. Drains silt up, sump pits fill, covers crack and need to be replaced. Pipes break and need to be repaired. The fact that Mohenjo-daro's drainage system functioned for centuries, through multiple phases of occupation and rebuilding, means that there was a sustained, continuous commitment to its upkeep. Someone had to inspect the drains. Someone had to organize the labor for cleaning and repair. Someone had to ensure that new construction connected properly to the existing system. This maintenance could have been organized by a centralized municipal authority, comparable to a modern city's public works department. Or it could have been organized at the neighborhood level, with each block or ward responsible for maintaining the section of drain that served its homes. Either way, it required coordination, commitment, and the allocation of labor and resources to a collective purpose over many generations. The periodic rebuilding of Mohenjo-daro provides further clues. The city was built in a floodplain and was subject to periodic flooding from the Indus River. Archaeological excavations have revealed multiple layers of construction, separated by layers of river-deposited silt. Each time the city was flooded, it was rebuilt, and each rebuilding followed the same basic plan, the same street grid, the same orientation, the same relationship between buildings and infrastructure. The rebuilding was not random. It was deliberate, organized, and consistent with the original design. Someone, some authority or some collective agreement ensured that the city was rebuilt according to the same standards each time. In a society without written building codes, this consistency is extraordinary. It speaks to a tradition so deeply embedded, so thoroughly shared, that it could be maintained across generations, even through the disruption of catastrophic flooding. The city also shows evidence of zoning, or at least of functional differentiation between neighborhoods. Certain areas of the lower city appear to have been associated with specific crafts or activities. Workshops for bead making are clustered in some areas. Pottery kilns are found in others. The Citadel Mound, with its public buildings, is functionally distinct from the residential lower city. This kind of functional differentiation does not happen by accident. It requires planning. It requires decisions about where different activities should take place, decisions that affect the entire community, and that must be agreed upon and enforced. The question of how these decisions were made brings us back to the fundamental mystery. In the absence of written records, we are left to speculate. But the speculation is not unconstrained. The physical evidence places limits on what is plausible. Whatever form of governance existed at Mohenjo-daro, it had to be capable of producing and maintaining a city of this complexity over a period of several centuries. It had to be capable of enforcing construction standards, maintaining public infrastructure, organizing the labor for periodic rebuilding, and managing the allocation of space for different functions. It did not have to be a monarchy. It did not have to be a dictatorship, but it had to be something. The city did not build itself. Some contemporary scholars have begun to explore models of governance drawn from anthropology and political science that might fit the Harappan evidence better than traditional models of kingship and hierarchy. The concept of heterarchy, a system of governance in which power is distributed among multiple competing or cooperating groups rather than concentrated in a single hierarchy, has been proposed as a possible model for the Indus Valley. In a heterarchical system, decisions are made through negotiation and consensus among multiple stakeholders, whether they are merchant guilds, religious communities, craft associations, or neighborhood councils. No single group holds supreme power, but the interaction among groups produces coordinated outcomes. This model could explain how the Indus Valley achieved standardization across vast distances without a visible king. Not through top-down command, but through bottom-up agreement, maintained by mutual interest and shared cultural norms. Another possibility is what political scientists call corporate governance, a system in which authority is vested in institutions rather than individuals. In such a system, the Great Bath might not have been built by a king's decree, but by a council of elders, a religious assembly, or a civic body whose authority was institutional rather than personal. Corporate governance leaves fewer traces in the archaeological record than personal rule because its symbols are collective rather than individual. There are no royal portraits because there is no single ruler to portray. There are no palaces because authority resides in the institution, not in the person. There are public buildings because the institution serves the public. These models are speculative. They cannot be proven with the evidence currently available. But they are not mere fantasy. They are informed by the physical evidence of the city itself and by the accumulated wisdom of anthropology, which has documented many societies around the world that achieve complex social organization without centralized hierarchical authority. The Indus Valley civilization may have been one such society, or it may not. The honest answer is that we do not know. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. We cannot prove any of this. We cannot prove that Mohenjo-daro was governed by consensus rather than by kings. We cannot prove that its planning was maintained by oral tradition rather than by written records. We cannot prove that its relative egalitarianism was real and not an artifact of incomplete excavation. Everything we believe about the governance of Mohenjo-daro is inference-educated guesswork built on the silent testimony of bricks and drains and the enigmatic symbols of an undeciphered script. The city speaks to us, but it speaks in a language we cannot understand. And the more closely we listen, the more we realize how much we are projecting our own hopes, our own fears, and our own assumptions onto the silent ruins of a world that may have been fundamentally different from anything we have ever known. there is a deeper dimension to this uncertainty that extends beyond academic debate. If Mohenjo-daro was indeed governed by some form of collective, non-hierarchical authority, then its collapse carries implications that are profoundly unsettling for how we think about the durability of democratic or consensus-based societies. If a city this well-planned, this well-maintained, this successful, could be built by cooperation rather than by coercion, then why did it not survive? What does it mean that the most egalitarian urban experiment of the ancient world ultimately dissolved, while the hierarchical civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia, with all their injustice and violence, endured for millennia? Does the story of Mohenjo-daro suggest that cooperative societies are inherently more fragile than authoritarian ones? Or does it suggest that the specific environmental challenges that overwhelmed the Indus Valley, the shifting rivers, and the failing monsoon would have destroyed any form of governance, hierarchical or egalitarian? These questions do not have easy answers. They resist the tidy narratives that we prefer. They force us to sit with ambiguity, to acknowledge the limits of what we know, and to recognize that the greatest achievements of the human past may have been produced by social arrangements that we do not fully understand and may not be able to replicate. The grid of Mohenjo-daro is precise, the drains are real, the bricks are standardized, the achievement is undeniable, but the system that produced it, the human arrangement of power and purpose that turned an idea into a city, remains invisible, silent, and stubbornly resistant to our attempts to understand it. And that silence is itself a kind of testimony. It testifies to the fragility of human memory, to the limits of archaeological method, and to the humbling truth that the past is not ours to know completely. Some things are lost, not because they were not important, but because the people who knew them did not write them down, or wrote them on materials that time has consumed. The governance of Mohenjo-daro may be one of those things. We may never know how the city was governed. We may never know who made the decisions that shaped the grid, the drains, the bricks, the wells. We may be left, forever, with only the effects and never the cause, with only the city and never the mind that conceived it. Over the past century, scholars from multiple disciplines have proposed a range of theories to explain the mysterious urban planning of Mohenjo-daro. Each theory offers a different lens through which to view the city, a different answer to the question of how this level of sophistication was achieved without the visible trappings of hierarchical power. Each theory illuminates certain aspects of the evidence, and each ultimately falls short of a complete explanation. The truth, if it exists in any recoverable form, may lie somewhere in the intersection of all these approaches, or it may lie in a direction that none of them has yet explored. The first and oldest theory is the one proposed by Sir John Marshall himself, the man who oversaw the first systematic excavations, and who first announced the discovery of the Indus Valley civilization to the world. Marshall, trained in the classical tradition and deeply familiar with the ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome, interpreted Mohenjo-daro through the lens of priestly authority. He suggested that the city was governed by a theocratic elite, a priestly class that derived its authority from religious ritual and that maintained social order through the management of sacred spaces and ceremonial practices. The Great Bath, in this interpretation, was a temple pool, a place for ritual purification under the supervision of priests who controlled access to the divine. The uniformity of the city's planning, the standardized bricks, the consistent architecture, all reflected the imposition of religious order on the physical environment, the transformation of the city into a sacred space in which every element was regulated by ritual law. Marshall's theory had an appealing logic. Religious authority is one of the oldest and most powerful forms of social control. A priestly class that controlled the rituals of purification, fertility, and protection could command obedience without military force. People would comply with building standards and contribute to public works, not because a king commanded them, but because the priests told them it was the will of the gods. The Great Bath's prominent position on the citadel mound, at the highest and most visible point of the city, was consistent with a ritual function. The trefoil pattern cloak of the priest-king figurine suggested a person of religious significance. The animal imagery on the seals, particularly the images of bulls, elephants, and the mysterious unicorn figure, might represent sacred animals or divine symbols. But Marshall's theory has significant weaknesses. The most obvious is that there is no clear evidence of temples at Mohenjo-daro. In Mesopotamia, temples were the largest and most prominent buildings in every city, easily identifiable by their distinctive architecture, their inscriptions, and the votive offerings deposited within them. In Egypt, temples were colossal structures covered in carved and painted religious imagery. At Mohenjo-daro, there is nothing comparable. The buildings on the citadel mound are large, but they are not decorated with religious imagery. They contain no altars, no cult statues, no votive deposits that can be identified with certainty. If they were temples stripped of every feature that makes a temple recognizable in every other ancient culture. There is a further problem with the theocratic theory. Priestly governance, wherever it has been documented in the ancient world, invariably produces a distinctive material signature. Temple economies generate records, lists of offerings, inventories of temple property, records of ritual obligations. The temples of Mesopotamia were great economic institutions, managing land, labor, and livestock, and they left behind vast archives of clay tablets documenting their activities. If Mohenjo-daro were governed by a similar theocratic system, we might expect to find comparable records, or at least the physical spaces, the archive rooms, and storage facilities in which such records were kept. We have found nothing of the kind. Furthermore, the absence of religious imagery extends beyond the citadel. Across the entire Indus Valley civilization, there are no monumental religious buildings, no great temples, no shrines that can be identified with certainty. The small terracotta figurines that are sometimes called mother goddesses or fertility figures are ambiguous. They might be religious objects, they might be toys, they might serve some purpose that has no analogy in our experience. Without inscriptions to identify them, their function remains interpretation rather than evidence. Marshall's theory of priestly governance remains possible but unproven, a projection of familiar patterns onto unfamiliar evidence. The priestly theory also struggles to explain the geographic uniformity of the civilization. Religious authority tends to be local. Different temples serve different communities. Different priesthoods maintain different traditions. The standardization of the Indus Valley, its uniform bricks, its consistent weights, its shared seal iconography across an area of 1.3 million square kilometers suggests a form of coordination that transcends local religious authority. A single priesthood maintaining identical standards across an area this vast, without written scriptures, without a hierarchical church structure, without any of the institutional apparatus that sustains religious authority in other traditions, would be without precedent. The second theory, which gained prominence in the mid-20th century, was that Mohenjo-daro was governed by a secular merchant class. This theory was championed by several scholars, including Walter Fairservice, who argued in the 1970s and 80s that the Indus Valley civilization was essentially a commercial enterprise, a vast trading network held together by the shared interests of merchants who cooperated to maintain the standards and infrastructure that facilitated trade. The standardized weights were tools of commerce. The seals were instruments of authentication and branding. The grid-planned cities were efficient centers of trade, designed to facilitate the movement of goods rather than to glorify rulers or gods. In this interpretation, the urban planning of Mohenjo-daro reflected the priorities of a merchant class: order, efficiency, predictability, and fairness. The standardized bricks ensured that buildings met a consistent quality standard, protecting property values and commercial reputation. The drainage system maintained the health of the population, protecting the labor force on which trade depended. The absence of palaces and monumental sculptures reflected the practical, commercial temperament of a society that valued profit over prestige, function over display. The merchant theory has the advantage of explaining many features of the city that are difficult to account for otherwise. The standardized weights make more sense as tools of trade than as instruments of religious or political control. The seals, with their animal motifs and brief inscriptions, are most naturally interpreted as trademarks or authentication devices. The distribution of craft workshops throughout the city, rather than their concentration in a single state-controlled facility, is consistent with a market economy in which individual producers compete for customers. But here is the problem with the merchant theory. It assumes that a class of merchants, acting in their collective self-interest, could produce and maintain the level of urban planning visible at Mohenjo-daro, and this assumption is questionable. Merchant communities are effective at establishing standards that facilitate trade, such as standardized weights and measures. They are capable of building infrastructure that directly serves commercial interests, such as ports, warehouses, and marketplaces. But they are not typically associated with the kind of comprehensive urban planning that encompasses street layouts, residential construction standards, public bathing facilities, and citywide sanitation systems. These are civic functions that benefit the community as a whole, not just the commercial class. Consider the drainage system through the lens of the merchant theory. A merchant's primary interest is the efficient movement and storage of goods. Drains do not facilitate trade. Wells do not increase profit margins. A bathing platform in every home does not help a merchant sell more carnelian beads. If the city were designed purely by and for merchants, we might expect to see excellent warehousing facilities, well-maintained roads to ports and trading partners, and perhaps a grand marketplace at the center of the city. We would not necessarily expect to see a comprehensive sanitation system serving every household regardless of wealth or commercial significance. And yet, that is precisely what Mohenjo-daro has. There is also a historical problem with the merchant theory. In most documented cases of merchant-governed cities, from the Phoenician city-states to the Venetian Republic to the Hanseatic League of medieval Germany, merchant governance produced significant inequality. The merchants enriched themselves at the expense of the laboring classes. The architecture of merchant cities reflected this inequality. Grand trading houses for the wealthy, cramped tenements for the workers. Mohenjo-daro does not show this pattern. The relative uniformity of its residential architecture suggests a degree of economic equality that is inconsistent with a society dominated by a self-enriching merchant class. If merchants governed Mohenjo-daro, they were merchants of an unusually public-spirited character, willing to invest in infrastructure that served the entire community rather than concentrating wealth in their own hands. This is possible, but it is unusual enough to require explanation. The merchant theory explains some of the evidence, but not all of it. It accounts for the commercial infrastructure, but not for the civic infrastructure. It explains the weights and the seals, but not the drains and the wells. It describes a city that serves trade, but not a city that serves people. And the physical evidence of Mohenjo-daro suggests a city that served people first and trade second. The third theory is perhaps the most radical and the most intellectually challenging. It proposes that Mohenjo-daro was governed not by priests, not by merchants, and not by kings, but by a form of collective, consensus-based governance that has no close parallel in the ancient world. This theory, associated with scholars including Gregory Possehl, Jonathan Mark Kenoyer, and others, takes the absence of hierarchical evidence seriously and asks what kind of social organization could produce the observed results without centralized, top-down authority. The theory draws on models from anthropology and political science, particularly the concepts of heterarchy, corporate governance, and segmentary society. In a heterarchical system, power is distributed among multiple groups or institutions that interact through negotiation and mutual accommodation, rather than through command and obedience. In a corporate governance model, authority is vested in institutions such as councils, guilds, or assemblies, rather than in individuals. In a segmentary society, the basic units of social organization are kinship groups or neighborhoods that manage their own affairs, while cooperating with other groups on matters of common interest. Applied to Mohenjo-daro, this theory suggests that the city's urban planning was the product of negotiated agreement among multiple groups, perhaps organized by occupation, kinship, neighborhood, or religious affiliation, who cooperated to establish and maintain shared standards without any single group holding supreme authority. The standardized bricks were not imposed by a king's decree, but agreed upon by a convention of builders. The drainage system was not designed by a royal engineer, but developed through generations of accumulated practice and maintained by neighborhood-level organizations, responsible for their own sections. The Great Bath was not built by a king for his glory, but by the community for its shared use. The numbers are striking when we consider what this theory implies about social organization. If Mohenjo-daro had a population of 30 to 40,000 people, organized into perhaps 3 to 5,000 households, then a consensus-based governance system would need to coordinate the decisions and actions of thousands of independent actors. This is not impossible. Modern studies of common pool resource management, particularly the work of the Nobel Prize-winning economist Elinor Ostrom, have shown that communities can successfully manage shared resources, including water, forests, and fisheries, through self-governing institutions that do not depend on external authority. Ostrom's research identified several design principles that characterize successful self-governing communities: clearly defined boundaries, rules adapted to local conditions, collective choice arrangements that allow most participants to contribute to decision-making, monitoring systems to detect violations, graduated sanctions for rule breakers, and mechanisms for conflict resolution. It is at least conceivable that the Indus Valley civilization developed institutions along these lines, institutions that maintained standards and managed infrastructure through collective agreement rather than through top-down command. But the collective governance theory has its own difficulties. The most obvious is the problem of scale. Ostrom's research focused primarily on small to medium-sized communities, typically numbering in the hundreds or low thousands. Mohenjo-daro was a city of 30 to 40,000 people. The Indus Valley civilization as a whole encompassed an estimated population of several million people spread across an area of 1.3 million square kilometers. Maintaining standardized bricks and weights across an area this large through consensus and social norms alone, without any form of centralized enforcement, would be an extraordinary achievement, perhaps unprecedented in human history. It is possible, but it strains belief. The fourth theory attempts to resolve this difficulty by proposing a hybrid model, a combination of elements from the other theories. In this interpretation, the Indus Valley civilization may have had multiple levels of governance, with different functions managed by different institutions at different scales. Trade may have been regulated by merchant guilds. Religious practice may have been managed by priestly communities. Urban planning may have been overseen by neighborhood councils or craft associations. And overarching coordination, the kind of broad standardization visible in the brick ratios and weight systems, may have been maintained by periodic assemblies or by the authority of a widely respected institution, perhaps the keepers of a sacred tradition associated with the Great Bath, whose authority was moral and cultural rather than political or military. This hybrid theory has the virtue of fitting the evidence better than any single theory. It accounts for the commercial sophistication of the civilization, the apparent importance of ritual purity, the civic character of the urban planning, and the absence of visible kingship, but it has the vice of complexity. A theory that requires multiple interacting institutions, none of which has left clear evidence in the archaeological record, is difficult to test and easy to tailor to any set of observations. It may be correct, but it may also be unfalsifiable, and a theory that cannot be tested is of limited scientific value. There is a recent body of research that approaches the question from an entirely different angle, not asking who governed the city, but asking how the city's design responded to its specific environmental challenges. This environmental functional interpretation, associated with scholars working in the fields of geoarchaeology and urban ecology, proposes that many features of Mohenjo-daro's urban planning can be understood as practical responses to the specific conditions of the Indus floodplain, rather than as expressions of political, ideology, or religious belief. The raised platform on which the city was built, for example, was not primarily a symbol of power or prestige. It was a practical solution to the problem of flooding. The Indus River, one of the most powerful and unpredictable rivers in Asia, flooded its banks regularly, depositing layers of silt across the floodplain. A city built at ground level would have been inundated and destroyed within a few years. The decision to raise the city on an artificial mound was not a political statement, it was an engineering necessity. Similarly, the covered drainage system was not merely an expression of civic values. It was a practical necessity in a hot, humid environment, where standing wastewater would quickly become a breeding ground for mosquitoes and a source of disease. The wide streets were not just aesthetically pleasing. They provided ventilation, channeling breezes through the city and moderating the extreme heat of the Indus Plain. This environmental interpretation has the advantage of grounding the discussion in verifiable physical facts. The Indus does flood. The climate is hot. Mosquitoes do breed in standing water. These are not matters of interpretation. They are matters of physics, biology, and geography. But the environmental interpretation, while illuminating, does not answer the governance question. It tells us why certain design features were necessary. It does not tell us who decided to implement them or how those decisions were enforced. Many cities face the same environmental challenges as Mohenjo-daro and respond to them far less effectively. The cities of the medieval Indus Valley, built on the same floodplain thousands of years later, did not achieve anything comparable to Mohenjo-daro's infrastructure, despite facing identical environmental pressures. Environment shapes the problem. It does not dictate the solution. The solution requires human agency, human organization, and human choice. And the nature of that agency at Mohenjo-daro remains unknown. The environmental angle does, however, help us understand one of the most debated structures at Mohenjo-daro, the so-called granary. Located on the citadel mound, this is a large rectangular structure measuring approximately 50 meters long and 27 meters wide, built on a platform of massive mud brick blocks with air channels running between them. Marshall and later excavators interpreted it as a state granary, a centralized storage facility for grain that would have been collected as taxes or tribute and redistributed to the population during times of need. This interpretation supported the idea of a centralized state with the power to collect and redistribute resources. But the granary interpretation has been challenged by subsequent researchers. No actual grain has been found in the building. The air channels beneath the platform, which were thought to provide ventilation for stored grain, might instead be structural features designed to prevent moisture from rising into the building from the damp floodplain soil. The building might have been a warehouse, a meeting hall, a market, or something else entirely. Michael Janssen, a German architect and urbanist who studied Mohenjo-daro extensively, argued that the building showed no features that would be necessary for grain storage and proposed that it served a different, possibly public, function. If the granary was not a granary, then one of the key pieces of evidence for a redistributive state economy at Mohenjo-daro falls away, and the case for decentralized or collective governance becomes stronger. Another structure that has prompted debate is a building sometimes called the Assembly Hall or the Pillared Hall. This is a large room containing rows of regularly spaced brick pillars that would have supported a flat roof. The room has been interpreted variously as a market hall, a meeting place for a governing council, a workshop, and a ceremonial space. If it was indeed an assembly hall, then it might represent the physical space in which collective governance was practiced, the room where councils met, where disputes were resolved, and where decisions about the city's management were made. But this interpretation, like so many at Mohenjo-daro, is based on inference from form rather than evidence from inscription, and it remains speculative. There is a recent body of research that approaches the question from an entirely different angle. This approach compares Mohenjo-daro not to other ancient cities, but to certain types of modern planned communities. Some scholars have noted similarities between Mohenjo-daro's layout and the design principles of modern planned towns in South Asia, particularly towns built around a central religious or communal facility, with residential areas radiating outward in an organized pattern. The argument is that the principles underlying Mohenjo-daro's design may reflect a South Asian cultural tradition of urban planning that is very old, perhaps much older than the mature Harappan period, and that persists in attenuated form in the region today. If this is true, then the planners of Mohenjo-daro were not inventing a new kind of city from scratch. They were drawing on a deep cultural tradition of spatial organization, a tradition transmitted through practice and custom rather than through written theory. The comparison with other planned cities of the ancient world is also instructive. The Egyptian workers' village at Kahun, built around 1895, before the Common Era, to house the workers constructing the pyramid of Senusret II, was a planned settlement laid out on a grid. But Kahun was a small town of roughly 5,000 residents, built by royal command for a specific purpose, and abandoned when the construction project was completed. It was not a living city that grew and adapted over centuries. The Assyrian city of Dur-Sharukin, built by King Sargon II around 700 before the Common Era, was also planned on a grid. But Dur-Sharukin was a royal creation, built to glorify a specific king, and it was abandoned after his death. These planned cities share certain formal similarities with Mohenjo-daro, but they differ fundamentally in their social character. They were top-down creations, imposed by royal authority for royal purposes. Mohenjo-daro, if the evidence is read correctly, was something different. A planned city that served its entire population, that was maintained by some form of collective authority over many centuries, and that expressed values of equity and public welfare rather than royal power. The fifth and perhaps most humbling interpretation is simply that we do not have enough evidence to answer the question. This is not a theory so much as an acknowledgement of our limitations. The Indus Valley civilization left behind no readable texts. The excavations at Mohenjo-daro are incomplete, with roughly 2/3 of the city still unexcavated and the lowest levels permanently waterlogged. The seals have not been deciphered. The governance structures, whatever they were, expressed themselves in materials or practices that have not survived. We are trying to understand a political system from its physical infrastructure alone, which is a bit like trying to understand the government of the United States by examining its highway system. You could learn a great deal about the country's organizational capacity, its engineering skills, its commitment to transportation, but you would learn nothing about its constitution, its elections, its Congress, or its president. The highways would tell you that someone was in charge. They would not tell you who. This is the honest position, and it is the one that most responsible archaeologists ultimately adopt. The question of who governed Mohenjo-daro remains open. It may remain open permanently. The evidence that could answer it may no longer exist, destroyed by time, by water, by the irreversible processes of decay that consume all organic materials and many inorganic ones over a span of 4,500 years. The city's planners, whoever they were, made the ironic decision to build their city of the most durable materials available, fired brick and stone, while apparently recording their governance in the most perishable materials available, or not recording it at all. The bricks survive, the decisions that shape them do not, and yet the question matters. It matters because Mohenjo-daro challenges our deepest assumptions about the relationship between power, planning, and the public good. If a city this sophisticated could be built without a king, then the assumption that centralized authority is necessary for civilizational achievement is wrong. If it required a king, but one who chose to invest in drains rather than palaces, then the assumption that ancient rulers were invariably self-aggrandizing is wrong. Either way, Mohenjo-daro forces us to revise our understanding of what ancient societies were capable of and what they chose to do with that capability. The implications extend beyond archaeology. They touch on questions about our own societies, our own cities, our own relationship to the infrastructure that sustains us. Who builds our cities? Whose interests do they serve? Are they designed for the well-being of all residents or for the profit of the few? The grid of Mohenjo-daro, with its drains that served every household and its wells that provided water to every neighborhood, represents a standard that many modern cities have not met. It is a reminder that the infrastructure of daily life, the drains and the wells and the streets, is not merely a technical problem. It is a moral one. A city's infrastructure reflects the values of the society that built it, and the infrastructure of Mohenjo-daro reflects values that, across 4.5 millennia of distance, still have the power to challenge and inspire. Then something happened that changed everything. Not a discovery of new ruins or a breakthrough in deciphering the script. Something slower and more devastating. The city itself began to die. And the way it died tells us something about the nature of the urban planning that had sustained it. The archaeological record of Mohenjo-daro's later phases reveals a city in decline, and the decline is visible precisely because the standards of the earlier phases were so high. In the later levels of occupation, the quality of construction drops. Bricks that were once standardized become irregular. Walls that were once straight begin to curve and lean. The drainage system, once maintained with meticulous care, falls into disrepair. Drains that were once covered and cleaned lie open and clogged with debris. New buildings are constructed in the streets themselves, narrowing the once wide thoroughfares and disrupting the grid pattern. In some areas, the great houses are subdivided into smaller units, their spacious courtyards partitioned by crude walls made of recycled brick. Pottery kilns appear in residential areas where they would not have been permitted during the city's prime. The evidence speaks of a society in which the rules were breaking down, in which the standards that had maintained order and quality for centuries were being abandoned. This decline is not unique to Mohenjo-daro. The same pattern appears at Harappa and at other major Harappan sites. It is a civilization-wide phenomenon, spanning several centuries and affecting every region. As discussed elsewhere, the causes are complex: shifting rivers, changing monsoon patterns, environmental degradation. But the way the decline manifests at Mohenjo-daro is particularly revealing for what it tells us about urban planning. The standards did not collapse all at once. They eroded gradually. Each generation's buildings were a little less carefully made than the previous generations. Each year, the drains were a little less well maintained. The decline was incremental, almost imperceptible from one year to the next, but devastating when viewed across the span of decades and centuries. This gradual erosion suggests that the maintenance of Mohenjo-daro's urban standards depended on ongoing social commitment, not just on initial design. A well-designed drainage system will fail if no one maintains it. A grid street plan will be disrupted if people are allowed to build in the streets. Standardized bricks require standardized brickmaking, which requires ongoing quality control. The urban planning of Mohenjo-daro was not a one-time achievement. It was a continuous process, maintained by the daily decisions of thousands of people over hundreds of years. When the social fabric that sustained those decisions began to fray, the physical fabric of the city frayed with it. The comparison with Harappa, the other great Harappan city, is instructive. Harappa is located in the Punjab, roughly 600 kilometers north of Mohenjo-daro, on the banks of the Ravi River, a tributary of the Indus. It was excavated beginning in 1920, even earlier than Mohenjo-daro, though the work was initially less systematic. Harappa shows the same basic features as Mohenjo-daro: a grid street plan, standardized bricks, covered drains, a raised citadel with public buildings, and a lower city of residential and commercial structures. The similarity between the two cities is remarkable given the distance that separates them. It suggests that both were built according to the same set of principles, the same design template, applied independently by builders who shared a common tradition but who were working 600 kilometers apart. Yet there are also differences between the two cities that complicate our understanding. Harappa's layout is less regular than Mohenjo-daro's. Its grid is less precise. Its residential architecture is more varied. Some scholars have interpreted these differences as evidence that Harappa developed more organically, with less centralized planning than Mohenjo-daro. Others argue that the differences are the result of Harappa's longer and more complex occupation history. The city was settled earlier than Mohenjo-daro and was rebuilt and modified over a longer period, resulting in more variation. The debate about the relative planning of the two cities mirrors the larger debate about governance. Were both cities planned by the same authority? Were they independently planned by local authorities following a shared tradition? Did the standards originate at one city and spread to the other, or were they developed simultaneously by communities that were in regular contact? Jonathan Mark Canoia, one of the foremost living scholars of the Indus Valley Civilization, has excavated at Harappa for decades and has argued for a model of competitive cooperation among different groups within Harappan cities. Canoia suggests that the major Harappan cities were not governed by a single authority, but by competing elites who vied for influence through trade, craft production, and the patronage of public works. In this model, the uniformity of Harappan standards reflects not the imposition of a single will, but the convergence of competing groups towards shared norms that benefited everyone. The standardized bricks, the uniform weights, the consistent drainage design, these were not decrees from above but equilibria reached through negotiation and competition. Each group had an incentive to maintain the standards, because departing from them would have disadvantaged them in trade and reduced their prestige. Canoia's model is sophisticated and consistent with much of the archaeological evidence, but it raises its own questions. Competition among elites typically produces visible displays of status: larger houses, finer goods, more elaborate tombs. These are precisely the things that are largely absent from the Harappan record. If competing groups were using public works as a form of status competition, we might expect to see variation in the quality and scale of infrastructure between neighborhoods controlled by different groups. But the infrastructure of Mohenjo-daro is strikingly uniform across the city. The drains in one neighborhood are the same as the drains in another. The bricks in one building are the same as the bricks in the building next door. This uniformity is difficult to explain as the product of competition. There is one more approach to the mystery that deserves mention, and it comes not from archaeology, but from the study of modern urban systems. Complexity theorists and urban planners have observed that many features of successful cities emerge not from top-down planning, but from the interaction of simple rules followed by individual actors. This is the principle of emergence: complex, ordered patterns arising from the interaction of many agents following simple local rules. A flock of birds forms complex, beautiful patterns, not because a leader bird directs the formation, but because each bird follows a few simple rules about distance and speed relative to its neighbors. Similarly, some features of urban planning might emerge from the accumulated decisions of thousands of individual builders, following a few shared conventions, such as the convention to orient houses away from main streets, or the convention to use bricks of a specific ratio. The emergence model is appealing because it does not require a centralized planner, it only requires shared rules. If every builder in Mohenjo-daro followed the same set of conventions learned from their elders and reinforced by social pressure, then the resulting city would display the kind of order and uniformity we observe, without anyone having drawn a master plan. The grid would emerge from the convention of building streets at right angles. The drainage system would emerge from the convention of connecting every house to the nearest street drain. The standardized bricks would emerge from the convention of making bricks in a specific ratio. No king needed, no master plan needed, just shared rules applied consistently by thousands of individuals over hundreds of years. But the emergence model, while powerful, has limitations. Emergence explains how order can arise from simple rules. It does not explain where the rules come from. Someone, at some point, had to establish the conventions. Someone had to decide that bricks should be made in a 4:2:1 ratio. Someone had to decide that streets should be 10 meters wide. Someone had to design the first drainage system and demonstrate that it worked. These initial decisions were not emergent. They were deliberate. They required knowledge, foresight, and authority. The emergence model can explain how the standards were maintained over time, but not how they were established in the first place. Someone had to be first. Someone had to say, this is the size of the brick. This is the width of the street. This is how the drain will be built. And that someone, whoever they were, left no trace of themselves in the record. Their decision persists in every brick and every drain of the city. Their identity is lost. The distinction between establishment and maintenance is crucial for understanding urban planning at Mohenjo-daro. The initial design of the city required deliberate, centralized decisions about layout, infrastructure, and standards. The maintenance of the city over centuries may have been more distributed, managed by neighborhood organizations and craft guilds following established conventions. The two processes, creation and maintenance, may have involved different forms of authority. The founding may have been directed by a strong leader or a small group of visionary planners. The continuation may have been managed by the distributed, consensus-based institutions that the archaeological evidence seems to suggest. If this is the case, then the debate about governance may be asking the wrong question. The question is not whether Mohenjo-daro was governed by centralized or decentralized authority. It may have been governed by both, at different times and for different purposes. And so we return again to the central mystery. The city was planned, the standards were real, the infrastructure was maintained for centuries. But the planners are invisible, the decision-makers are unknown. The authority that established and enforced the standards left no monument to itself, carved no inscription celebrating its achievements, built no palace to house its power. Somewhere in the dust of Mohenjo-daro, beneath the waterlogged layers that we cannot reach, beneath the crumbling bricks that we are slowly losing, the answer may exist. Or it may have been lost forever, dissolved by time and salt and the slow forgetting that consumes all things that are not deliberately preserved. The implications extend beyond archaeology. They touch on questions about our own societies, our own cities, our own relationship to the infrastructure that sustains us. Who builds our cities? Whose interests do they serve? Are they designed for the well-being of all residents, or for the profit of the few? The grid of Mohenjo-daro, with its drains that served every household and its wells that provided water to every neighborhood, represents a standard that many modern cities have not met. It is a reminder that the infrastructure of daily life, the drains and the wells and the streets, is not merely a technical problem. It is a moral one. A city's infrastructure reflects the values of the society that built it, and the infrastructure of Mohenjo-daro reflects values that, across 4.5 millennia of distance, still have the power to challenge and inspire. And this is where the answer becomes deeply unsettling, because the city that embodied those values could not save itself. The drains that served every household eventually clogged with the debris of a declining society. The streets that ran in perfect lines were eventually blocked by the improvised shelters of squatters living in the ruins of a dead civilization. The standards that maintained order for 700 years eventually dissolved in the face of environmental pressures that no amount of civic virtue could overcome. The most carefully planned city of the ancient world became, in the end, just another mound of dust on the Indus plain. And the threat continues. The ruins of Mohenjo-daro are today a UNESCO World Heritage Site, designated in 1980. But the designation has not saved them. The city is under assault from forces that are, in their own way, as destructive as the environmental changes that ended the civilization itself. The primary threat is salt. The water table beneath Mohenjo-daro has risen significantly since the construction of modern irrigation systems in the region. As water is drawn up through the ancient brickwork by capillary action, it carries dissolved salts with it. When the water evaporates on the surface of the bricks, the salt is deposited in the pores of the clay. As the salt crystals grow, they exert pressure on the surrounding material, cracking and eventually destroying the brick from within. This process, called salt weathering, is relentless. It cannot be reversed, and it is eating Mohenjo-daro alive. Archaeologists and conservators have been sounding the alarm for decades. In the 1970s, UNESCO launched a major international campaign to save Mohenjo-daro. The campaign funded conservation work, including the construction of drainage channels to lower the water table and the application of chemical treatments to slow the salt damage. But the treatments were only partially effective, and the underlying problem, the high water table caused by modern irrigation, persists. Every year, more bricks crumble. Every year, more walls collapse. Every year, more of the evidence that might one day help us understand this extraordinary city is lost. The irony is bitter. Mohenjo-daro's builders created a city designed to manage water with extraordinary sophistication. Their drainage system was the marvel of the ancient world. And now, 4,500 years later, water is destroying what they built. The covered drains that once carried wastewater safely away from the city now channel salt-laden groundwater into the very walls they were designed to protect. The engineering genius of the Harappan builders has been turned against their own creation by the careless management of water in the modern era. This is not merely an archaeological problem, it is a moral one. Mohenjo-daro is one of the most important archaeological sites on Earth. It represents one of humanity's greatest achievements in urban planning and civic infrastructure. Its loss would be irreplaceable, and yet the resources devoted to its preservation are pitifully inadequate compared to the scale of the threat. The city that was built to last is being allowed to die. The drains that served every household are clogged with salt. The bricks that were standardized to a ratio of 4 to 2 to 1 are dissolving into powder. The grid that ran straight and true for 5,000 years is being erased, one crumbling wall at a time. The preservation crisis underscores the fragility of all human achievement. Mohenjo-daro survived for 5 millennia. Its bricks outlasted the civilization that made them, outlasted the memory of the civilization, outlasted the languages spoken by the people who lived there, but they will not outlast the indifference of the present. If current trends continue, significant portions of the exposed ruins may be lost within a generation. The city that we cannot fully understand may soon become a city that we can no longer see, and with it will go evidence that is irreplaceable, evidence that might one day have answered the questions that a century of scholarship has failed to resolve. The clock is ticking, the salt is rising, the bricks are falling, and the mystery of who planned the greatest city of the ancient world grows deeper with every year that passes. The deeper truth about Mohenjo-daro's urban planning is not a truth about drains or bricks or street grids. It is a truth about values. Every city is a physical expression of the values of the society that builds it. The skyline of a modern financial capital, with its glass towers competing for height, expresses the values of competitive capitalism. The monuments of ancient Rome, with their triumphal arches and imperial palaces, express the values of military conquest and authoritarian power. The cathedrals of medieval Europe, soaring above the squat dwellings of ordinary people, express the values of religious devotion and ecclesiastical authority. A city does not just house its inhabitants, it tells them who they are. It tells them what matters. What did Mohenjo-daro tell its inhabitants? What values were encoded in its grid, its drains, its wells, its great bath? The answer, insofar as we can reconstruct it from the mute testimony of archaeology, is startling. Mohenjo-daro told its inhabitants that what mattered was not the glory of kings or the grandeur of gods, but the mundane, essential, unglamorous business of keeping people clean, keeping them healthy, keeping them connected to fresh water and separated from their own waste. The city's greatest investment was not in temples or palaces, but in infrastructure. Its most impressive engineering was not decorative but functional. Its values, as expressed in brick and mortar and clay pipe, were values of collective well-being, of public health, of civic order maintained for the benefit of all. Let that sink in. In an age when every other great civilization was pouring its resources into monuments to power and piety, the people of Mohenjo-daro were building drains, not because they lacked the engineering skill for monuments. They clearly had the skill. The Great Bath, with its waterproof bitumen lining and its sophisticated drainage, demonstrates engineering capabilities that could easily have been directed toward the construction of temples or palaces. They chose not to. They chose drains. They chose wells. They chose bathing platforms in every home. They chose a city that worked for everyone, rather than a city that dazzled with the wealth and power of a few. This choice, if choice it was, is the most remarkable thing about Mohenjo-daro. It is more remarkable than the grid, more remarkable than the standardized bricks, more remarkable than the drainage system itself, because it suggests a set of priorities, a moral framework that is radically different from the one that governed every other ancient civilization we know of. It suggests a society that valued the common good over individual glory, that measured its success not by the height of its monuments, but by the health of its people. This is not science fiction. This is what the evidence shows. a city of 30 to 40,000 people, built nearly 5,000 years ago, in which the primary focus of collective effort was not warfare, not religion, not royal display, but the infrastructure of daily life. The clean water, the covered drains, the bathing platforms, the straight streets, the standardized bricks, all of it directed toward the same end, making the city a good place to live for its inhabitants, not for its rulers, for its inhabitants. The implications of this are profound and extend far beyond the study of ancient civilizations. If Mohenjo-daro demonstrates that a complex, large-scale urban society can organize itself around the principles of collective welfare rather than hierarchical power, then the assumption that hierarchy is necessary for civilization is challenged. If a city this sophisticated can be built without kings, without armies, without monumental displays of authority, then the forms of power that dominate the modern world are not the only forms possible. Other arrangements are conceivable. Other values can drive the construction of cities. The lesson of Mohenjo-daro is not that egalitarian utopia is achievable. The city ultimately failed, but it is that the priorities we bring to city building are choices, not necessities. We can choose to build cities that serve people rather than power. We can choose to invest in infrastructure rather than monuments. We can choose to measure our civilization by the quality of life of its ordinary citizens rather than by the grandeur of its elite. Let that sink in. There is another dimension to the deeper truth that involves the nature of knowledge itself. The urban planning of Mohenjo-daro represents a body of knowledge that was accumulated, refined, and transmitted across many generations. The knowledge of how to survey a site and lay out a grid. The knowledge of how to calculate the slope of a drainage channel. The knowledge of how to fire bricks to the correct hardness. The knowledge of how to seal a pool with bitumen so that it holds water under pressure. The knowledge of how to build a well that remains functional for centuries. Each of these skills represents decades or centuries of accumulated experience, of trial and error, of problems encountered and solved, of techniques developed and improved. This knowledge was not written down, as far as we know. It was carried in the minds and hands of the people who practiced it. The builders, the brickmakers, the drain layers, the well diggers. It was transmitted from master to apprentice, from parent to child, from one generation to the next, through the intimate hands-on process of learning by doing. It was embodied knowledge, knowledge that existed not in books or documents, but in the skilled practice of craft. When the civilization collapsed, this knowledge was lost, not destroyed by fire or flood, not suppressed by conquerors, simply abandoned, because the communities that practiced it dispersed and the conditions that required it no longer existed. The people who knew how to build Mohenjo-daro's drains moved to small farming villages where drains were not needed. The people who knew how to standardize bricks moved to communities where building codes did not exist. The knowledge that had taken centuries to develop was lost in a generation, dissolved by the simple fact that no one needed it anymore. This is the fragility that haunts all embodied knowledge. Written knowledge can survive the death of the community that created it. A book can be read by someone who never met the author. A clay tablet can be deciphered millennia after it was inscribed. But embodied knowledge, knowledge that exists only in practice, only in the hands and minds of living practitioners, dies when its practitioners die or stop practicing. And no amount of archaeological excavation can recover it. We can see the drains of Mohenjo-daro. We can measure them. We can photograph them. But we cannot know how they were built, not in the practical hands-on sense. The specific techniques, the tricks of the trade, the 1,000 small decisions that a skilled drain layer makes in the course of a day's work, all of that is gone. We have the product. We have lost the process. This loss is not unique to the Indus Valley. It is a universal feature of civilizational collapse. Knowledge is fragile, skills are perishable, traditions are mortal, and the rate at which embodied knowledge can be lost is far faster than the rate at which it can be accumulated. It takes generations to develop the skills needed to build a city like Mohenjo-daro. It takes only one generation of disruption to lose them. The asymmetry is devastating. Building takes time. Losing takes almost no time at all. Consider the specific skills that would have been required to plan and construct Mohenjo-daro. The city's builders needed to understand surveying, the art of measuring land and determining elevations across a large area. They needed to understand hydrology, the behavior of water as it flows through channels and drains, responding to gravity, slope, and the friction of surrounding materials. They needed to understand soil mechanics, the properties of different types of earth, and how they respond to weight, water, and time. They needed to understand materials science, at least in a practical sense, knowing how different types of clay respond to firing at different temperatures, how to select the right materials for waterproofing, how to judge the structural capacity of a brick wall. They needed to understand logistics, the organization of labor, materials, and time to bring a large construction project to completion, and they needed to understand public health, at least intuitively, knowing that the separation of wastewater from living space was essential to the well-being of the population. Each of these knowledge domains represents generations of accumulated experience. Each was carried by specific groups of practitioners, guilds, or families of builders, surveyors, brickmakers, and drain layers who passed their knowledge from one generation to the next through hands-on training. The entire system of knowledge was distributed across these groups, and the system as a whole was greater than the sum of its parts. No single individual knew everything needed to build the city. The knowledge was collective, distributed, and interdependent, and this made it both powerful and vulnerable. Powerful because the combination of many specialties produced results that no single specialty could achieve alone. Vulnerable because the loss of any one specialty weakened the entire system. When the civilization dispersed, the specialties dispersed with it. The builder who knew how to survey a site ended up in a small village where surveying was not needed. The brickmaker who knew the correct firing temperature found herself in a community that built with mud rather than fired brick. The drain layer who understood the principles of gravity-fed flow moved to a settlement that managed its waste by simply dumping it outside the village. Each practitioner, isolated from the others, lost the context that gave their skill its purpose. And without that context, the skill itself withered. The builder forgot the surveying techniques that were not practiced. The brickmaker's children saw no reason to learn the precise firing methods that their mother had mastered. The drain layer's grandchildren never learned to grade a channel because there were no channels to grade. Within 2 or 3 generations, the knowledge that had built Mohenjo-daro was extinct, not because anyone decided to destroy it, not because a conqueror burned the libraries or killed the practitioners, simply because the conditions that sustained it no longer existed. The knowledge had been adapted to a specific way of life, urban life in a planned city, and when that way of life ended, the knowledge ended with it. This is the deepest form of loss, not the loss of things, the loss of knowing. There is a concept in the philosophy of technology called technological regression, the idea that the overall level of technological capability in a society can decline over time. The Indus Valley civilization is one of the clearest examples in the archaeological record. The generation that built Mohenjo-daro's drainage system possessed knowledge and skills that the generation living in its ruins just 2 centuries later no longer possessed. The later Harappan communities were, in terms of urban engineering, less capable than their ancestors. The direction of change was backward, not forward. This regression was not caused by a decline in intelligence. The people who abandoned Mohenjo-daro were biologically identical to those who built it. What they lacked was not ability, but context. The knowledge that built Mohenjo-daro was contextual, making sense only within the framework of urban society. When that framework dissolved, the knowledge became useless and was abandoned. Intelligence without context is like a seed without soil. This has implications for our own time. We assume our knowledge is safe because it is recorded in books and databases. But recorded knowledge is not the same as practiced knowledge. A book that describes how to build a drain is not the same as a person who knows how to build one. Skill cannot be stored on a shelf. It must be practiced and transmitted through you doing. When the last practitioner stops practicing, the skill is lost, regardless of how many books describe it. The ancient Romans wrote treatises on engineering. But after Rome fell, medieval builders could not replicate Roman achievements despite having access to those texts. The gap between text and practice, between knowing that and knowing how, is vast. Mohenjo-daro's builders had no text at all. Their knowledge was entirely embodied, entirely dependent on the living chain of transmission from master to apprentice. When the chain broke, everything was lost. We are left with the products of genius, and no access to the genius itself. And yet the products themselves speak volumes if we are willing to listen carefully. The drains of Mohenjo-daro, examined closely, reveal decisions that go beyond mere engineering competence. They reveal priorities. The fact that the drains were covered, not open, tells us that the planners valued hygiene and the prevention of contamination over the simpler, cheaper option of open channels. The fact that the drains were fitted with sump pits tells us that the planners anticipated the need for maintenance and designed the system to be maintainable. The fact that the covers were removable tells us that the planners thought about access for inspection and cleaning. Each of these design choices represents a decision point, a moment where the planners chose one option over another, and in each case they chose the option that prioritized long-term function and public health over short-term convenience and cost. The wells tell a similar story. The density of wells in Mohenjo-daro, with perhaps one well for every 3 or 4 houses, tells us that the planners valued universal access to fresh water. They did not build a single grand aqueduct serving a central fountain, as the Romans would later do. They distributed the water supply throughout the city, bringing it close to every household. This distributed model is more expensive to build and maintain than a centralized model, because it requires more individual wells, more construction labor, and more ongoing maintenance. But it is more equitable. It ensures that every family has access to water without having to walk long distances or wait in queues. The choice of distributed water supply over centralized supply is a value judgment, not just an engineering decision. It tells us that the planners of Mohenjo-daro prioritized equity of access over efficiency of provision. The street layout reinforces this interpretation. The grid pattern, with its wide main streets and narrower side lanes, creates a hierarchy of public space that is functional rather than ceremonial. The wide streets facilitate movement, ventilation, and drainage. The narrower lanes provide access to individual homes while maintaining a degree of privacy and security. There are no grand ceremonial avenues of the kind found in Egyptian or Mesopotamian cities, processional routes designed to showcase the power of the ruler. The streets of Mohenjo-daro are designed for use, not for display. They serve the people who walk them, not the ruler who commands them. Even the orientation of houses, with their blank walls facing the main streets and their entrances set on side lanes, tells us something about values. This design prioritizes privacy over public display. In many ancient cities, the homes of the wealthy face outward, presenting elaborate facades to the street as a display of status and wealth. In Mohenjo-daro, even the largest homes turn their faces away from the public gaze. The exterior walls are plain and unadorned. The interior courtyards, hidden from view, are where the life of the household took place. This architectural convention suggests a culture that valued privacy, modesty, and the separation of public and private life. It suggests a society in which status was not displayed on the street, but expressed in other, less visible ways. All of these design choices, taken together, paint a picture of a society with a distinctive set of values. A society that valued public health, equitable access to resources, functional efficiency, privacy, and the well-being of ordinary people. A society that invested its collective resources not in monuments to power, but in the infrastructure of daily life. A society that, in the language of its bricks and drains and wells, articulated a vision of the good city that is as compelling today as it was 5,000 years ago. The deeper truth about Mohenjo-daro's urban planning is that it was both an extraordinary achievement and an extraordinarily vulnerable one. It depended not just on physical infrastructure, but on social infrastructure, on the networks of training, practice, and transmission that kept the knowledge alive. When the social infrastructure collapsed, the physical infrastructure followed. The drains clogged, the bricks crumbled, the knowledge evaporated. and the city, the magnificent, egalitarian, meticulously planned city, became a mound of dust, waiting 4,000 years for someone to dig it up and wonder. There is a question that Mohenjo-daro poses to every visitor, every student, every scholar who confronts its ruins. It is not a question about the past. It is a question about the present. The question is this: what are our cities for? We assume the answer is obvious. Cities are for living in. Cities are for commerce, for culture, for the exchange of ideas and goods. Cities are for people. But the history of urbanism suggests a more complicated truth. Most cities, throughout most of human history, have been built primarily for power. They are expressions of political authority, economic dominance, and military strength. Their grandest buildings are palaces and corporate towers. Their most impressive infrastructure serves the movement of armies and the accumulation of wealth. Their design reflects the priorities of those who hold power, not the needs of those who merely live. Mohenjo-daro was different. Its grandest building was a public bath. Its most impressive infrastructure was a drainage system that served every household. Its design reflected values of equity and collective welfare that are largely absent from the urban planning of both ancient and modern cities. And this difference is not merely an interesting historical fact. It is a challenge. It challenges the assumption that cities must be organized around hierarchy. It challenges the assumption that urban planning must serve the interests of power. It challenges the assumption that the ancient world had nothing to teach the modern world about how to build a good city. Consider the modern world's approach to urban sanitation. Globally, according to data from the World Health Organization, approximately 2 billion people still lack access to basic sanitation facilities. Open defecation remains common in parts of South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and other developing regions. Waterborne diseases remain major killers. In the city that built the Great Bath 5,000 years ago, the descendants of the Indus Valley people, living in the same region, often lack access to the covered drains and clean water that their distant ancestors took for granted. The progress that we associate with modernity has not been evenly distributed, and the standard set by Mohenjo-daro, the standard of universal access to sanitation, remains unmet for a significant portion of the world's population. This is not an argument for nostalgia. The ancient world was not a golden age. Life in Mohenjo-daro was hard, short by modern standards, and constrained by limitations that we can barely imagine. But it is an argument for humility. If a Bronze Age city could provide covered drains to every household, then our failure to do the same with modern technology and modern resources is not a technical problem. It is a problem of priorities. It is a problem of values. It is a problem of choosing where to invest our collective resources and whose well-being to prioritize. The story of Mohenjo-daro also carries implications for the way we think about cultural memory and the preservation of knowledge. The Indus Valley civilization created one of the most remarkable urban environments in human history, and then it was forgotten. Completely, absolutely, irrecoverably forgotten for nearly 4,000 years. No text preserved its name, no tradition recalled its achievements. The knowledge of how to build a city like Mohenjo-daro was lost, and the world was poorer for its loss. When the modern science of sanitation was developed in 19th century Europe, it was developed from scratch, through painful trial and error, through cholera epidemics and great stinks and tens of thousands of preventable deaths. The knowledge that could have shortened that process by millennia had already been developed once in the Indus Valley, but it had been lost. This should give us pause. What knowledge are we at risk of losing today? What skills, what techniques, what ways of understanding the world are currently held by small communities of practitioners who could be dispersed or displaced within a generation? The Indus Valley civilization was not a small community. It was one of the largest and most sophisticated societies on Earth. And yet its knowledge was lost. If it could happen to them, it can happen to us. The lesson is not to despair, but to take preservation seriously, to recognize that knowledge is fragile, that skills are perishable, and that the accumulation of centuries can be erased in a generation if we are not careful. The Mohenjo-daro story also invites us to reconsider what we mean by progress. We tend to measure progress in terms of technology. Faster machines, taller buildings, more powerful weapons, more sophisticated communications. By these measures, the modern world is incomparably more advanced than anything the Indus Valley produced. But if we measure progress in terms of equity, of the distribution of essential services to all members of a community, then the picture is more complicated. Mohenjo-daro achieved something that many modern cities still struggle with: universal access to basic sanitation and clean water. The city's infrastructure did not discriminate by wealth or status. Every household, from the largest courtyard house to the smallest single-room dwelling, was connected to the drainage system. Every neighborhood had access to wells. The Great Bath served the community, not the elite. By the measure of equitable access to essential services, Mohenjo-daro was, in at least one narrow but important respect, more advanced than many cities today. This is a sobering thought. It suggests that technological progress and social progress do not always move in the same direction. A society can be technologically primitive and socially advanced. A society can be technologically sophisticated and socially backward. The two dimensions of progress are independent, and the failure to recognize this has led to distorted understandings of both the ancient world and the modern one. Mohenjo-daro's builders lacked metal tools, wheeled vehicles, and written language, at least in any form we can read. But they built a city that served its people with a thoroughness that many modern cities, with all their technological advantages, have not matched. This forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about our own civilization. We have technologies that the Harappan builders could not have dreamed of. We can move Earth with machines, survey sites with satellites, communicate plans across continents in seconds. We have building codes, environmental regulations, public health departments, urban planning agencies. We have entire university departments devoted to the study of how to build cities that work. And yet, in much of the world, people still live without covered drains. People still lack access to clean water. People still die of waterborne diseases that the builders of Mohenjo-daro had learned to prevent. The gap between what we know and what we do, between our technological capability and our social achievement, is a standing rebuke from the ruins of Sind. There is also a broader philosophical question raised by Mohenjo-daro's example. The city represents a road not taken, a path in the evolution of human civilization that was abandoned, forgotten, and only rediscovered by accident. What if the Indus Valley model of urban planning, the model that prioritized equity and collective welfare, had survived and spread? What if the ideas embodied in Mohenjo-daro's drains and wells and grid had been transmitted to subsequent civilizations rather than being lost? Would the history of urbanism have been different? Would cities have developed differently if the Harappan model, rather than the Egyptian or Mesopotamian model, had been the template? These are counterfactual questions, and they cannot be answered with certainty. But they are worth asking because they remind us that the way things are is not the way things had to be. Other paths were possible. Other values could have prevailed. The fact that they did not prevail is not evidence that they were wrong. It is evidence only that history took a different turn. There is one more implication of Mohenjo-daro's story that deserves reflection. The city's apparent egalitarianism, its investment in infrastructure that served all residents rather than just the elite, may have been both its greatest strength and its most important vulnerability. A city built for its people inspires loyalty and cooperation. People who benefit from shared infrastructure are more likely to contribute to its maintenance. A society that distributes the fruits of collective effort equitably is more cohesive, more resilient, and more productive than one that concentrates wealth in the hands of a few. These are the strengths of the Mohenjo-daro model. But the vulnerability is this: a society that invests in the common good depends on the common commitment. If the commitment weakens, if people begin to free ride on the contributions of others, if the social norms that maintain cooperation begin to erode, then the entire system is at risk. A king can compel obedience, even when his subjects are reluctant. A cooperative society cannot. It depends on willing participation, on the voluntary adherence to shared norms, on the daily choice of thousands of individuals to do their part. When the environment changed, and the stresses on the Harappan social system increased, The cooperative bonds that held the society together may have been the first things to fail, not because cooperation is weak, but because it requires conditions of relative stability and mutual trust that are difficult to maintain during a crisis. In the end, the story of Mohenjo-daro's urban planning is a story about what human beings are capable of when they choose to build for each other rather than for themselves. It is a story about drains, about bricks, about wells and bathing platforms and streets that run straight and true through the hot, flat landscape of the Indus Plain. It is a story about the most unglamorous and most essential elements of civilized life: clean water, sanitation, shelter, order, and it is a story about loss. About the loss of a city, of a civilization, of a body of knowledge that took centuries to build and was scattered in a generation. The ruins of Mohenjo-daro do not tower above the landscape like the pyramids of Giza. They do not dazzle like the temples of Angkor. They do not inspire awe in the way that the Colosseum or the Parthenon inspire awe. They are modest. They are quiet. They are slowly crumbling. To the casual observer, they might look like little more than a field of broken walls and exposed foundations, baking in the relentless sun of Sind. But to anyone who understands what they represent, they are among the most important ruins on earth. They are the remains of a city that chose a different path, a city that invested in the well-being of its people rather than in the glory of its rulers, a city that built the most sophisticated sanitation system of the ancient world and made it available to every household, not just the wealthy and the powerful. That city is gone. Its people are gone. Its planners, whoever they were, are gone. The knowledge they carried, the skills they practiced, the decisions they made, all of it is gone, vanished into the silence that swallows all things that are not written down. What remains are bricks, drains, wells, a great empty pool that once held water and now holds only dust and the memory of water. The skeleton of a city, stripped of its life, stripped of its people, stripped of its purpose, but still standing, still testifying in its mute brick and mortar way to what was once achieved in this place by people whose names we will never know. We build cities today at a pace that would have astonished the Harappan planners. We build them with materials they could not have imagined, on scales they could not have conceived, with technologies that would have seemed like magic to the brickmakers and drain layers of Mohenjo-daro. And yet most of the cities we build fail the test that Mohenjo-daro passed, the test of equitable service to all residents. We build cities with gleaming towers and neglected slums. We build cities where the wealthy have private gardens and the poor have no clean water. We build cities where the infrastructure serves the interests of developers and commuters rather than the health and well-being of every household. We build cities that are monuments to inequality, designed to separate rather than to unite, to concentrate rather than to distribute. Mohenjo-daro was not a perfect city. No city is perfect. It was built in a floodplain that would eventually defeat it. It relied on environmental conditions that would eventually change. It carried within it the seeds of its own dissolution, as all complex systems do. But in the centuries of its prime, it achieved something that deserves to be remembered. It achieved something that deserves to be studied. It achieved something that, in its quiet, unglamorous way, challenges us to do better. There is a phrase that archaeologists sometimes use when they describe Mohenjo-daro to visitors and students. They call it the city without a face. The phrase captures the essential mystery. Every other great city of the ancient world has a face. Egypt has the face of the pharaoh. Mesopotamia has the face of Gilgamesh. Greece has the face of Pericles. Rome has the face of Caesar. These are cities that we can personify, that we can associate with specific individuals whose names and deeds have been recorded and remembered. Mohenjo-daro has no face, no name, no personality. It has only its infrastructure, its bricks and drains and wells, speaking for a civilization that cannot speak for itself. And perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps a city that was built not for the glory of individuals, but for the welfare of the community, should be remembered not by the face of a ruler, but by the quality of its drains. Perhaps the truest monument to the people of Mohenjo-daro is not a statue or an inscription, but the simple, enduring fact that they built a city where everyone had access to clean water and covered sanitation, where the streets ran straight and the bricks were true and the drains worked for everyone, rich and poor alike. That is not a glamorous legacy. but it is a worthy one, and it is a legacy that, in its own quiet way, outlasts the grandeur of pyramids and the glory of empires. The grid of Mohenjo-daro runs north to south, east to west, as it has run for nearly 5,000 years. The drains descend from higher ground to lower, following the slope that was calculated once and has not changed. The bricks maintain their ratio of 4 to 2 to 1, the ratio that was established once and held firm across an area larger than ancient Egypt. These facts are not impressive in the way that a pyramid is impressive. They are not dramatic. They do not photograph well. They do not inspire epic poetry or Hollywood films, but they are, in their quiet way, among the most extraordinary facts in the entire record of human achievement. They tell us that once, long ago, in a river valley that is now dry and dusty and largely forgotten, a group of people built a city that worked. Not a city that impressed, not a city that dominated, a city that worked. For everyone, that is the legacy of Mohenjo-daro. Not the bricks themselves, which are crumbling, not the drains, which are clogged, not the script, which is silent. The legacy is the idea that a city can be built for its people, the idea that infrastructure can serve the common good, the idea that the measure of a civilization is not the height of its monuments but the depth of its commitment to the well-being of ordinary lives. That idea was born on the banks of the Indus nearly 5,000 years ago. It was lost for 4,000 years. It was rediscovered in the ruins of a dead city by archaeologists who could not quite believe what they had found. The idea survives. The city does not. The bricks are falling. The drains are filling with salt. The water table is rising, and the walls are dissolving. And somewhere beneath the ruins, beneath the waterlogged layers that we cannot reach, beneath the silt deposited by 4,000 years of Indus floods, the original city lies buried. The first grid, the first drains, the first standardized bricks, the foundations of a vision that we can see the effects of but can never fully understand. The wind moves across the mound of Mohenjo-daro. It carries the dust of ancient bricks, particles so fine that they are invisible to the eye. That dust settles on the surrounding fields, on the irrigation canals of modern Sindh, on the water that flows through channels built by engineers who have never heard of the Great Bath, and who have no idea that the ground beneath their feet contains the remains of the most carefully planned city the ancient world ever produced. The dust of Mohenjo-daro mingles with the soil of the present, invisible, forgotten, but still there, still part of the landscape, still part of the story, and the grid endures. Beneath the rubble, beneath the salt, beneath the weight of 4.5 millennia of silence, the streets of Mohenjo-daro still run straight, north to south, east to west, as they were planned, as they were built, as they will remain, for as long as the bricks hold, for as long as the earth remembers, for as long as someone, somewhere, pauses to ask, who built this city, and what were they trying to tell us? The answer is in the drains, the answer is in the wells, the answer is in the bricks, each one the same as the next, each one a small testament to a society that believed in standards, in fairness, in the quiet dignity of a city that works. The answer has been there for 5,000 years. We are only now learning how to hear it.